found a trail of documentary evidence to show that from the scratch, the Union government was rigging the auctions in a fashion that eventually only Adani Group could get much of this.
So the surprise for me was that the U.S. New York State is prosecuting Adani, and nobody in India is prosecuting Adani.
You'll always have a Mr. Adani or somebody else who's a rising star of a particular era as a business proposition in an emerging economy. The worrisome bit is of to look around and say, what are the institutions around this time doing?
Shouldn't the market sort of correct itself or regulate itself?
Our imagination of what a regulator ought to be, I think we've missed the bus on that.
Hi, and welcome to episode 35 of the India Dialogue. We're so grateful you're with us. I'm joined by my co-host Manu Mitali and a special guest today. Let me introduce them. Manu is an advocate and a lawyer with his own law practice and a spokesperson for DMK. Mitali is the acting director at the Reuters Institute and well known for her time at CNBC. She's also an author. I'm Ruchir. I'm the CEO at Distributed Energy and chair of School of Policy and Governance. We're joined by a special guest today, Nitin Sethi, who we've brought here for discussing Adani and the work he's done on it. But Nitin is the founding editor at the Reporters Collective, as well as a visiting faculty at Ashoka University. We're so grateful you're here with us, Nitin. Normally, we dive in every week into issues that matter in India, try to have friendly disagreements, and go to the depth of the different aspects and facets of that issue. Today, as I mentioned earlier, we'll go through the Adani topic, and Manu will set the scene. Manu?
Well, thank you, Ruchir. Lovely to have you, Nitin. Before we dive into specifics of the Adani issue, I just want to say I'm very glad to have Nitin here. I know for him for some time now, from his earlier avatar prior to Reporters Collective. But really, I think, Nitin, if you can start us off by telling us a little bit about the Reporters Collective. I want more people to know about it, like I do. And if you can tell us about some of the work that you've done with them, that would be a great start. And then I will get into the specific issue we want to unpack today.
Hey, thank you all three for having me here and then to giving me the opportunity to pitch on TRC as well on your time. For your readers and watchers, Reporters Collective is a small non-profit organization we started about 5 years ago informally and 3 years ago formally. Um, it came about at a time where investigative journalism in particular, but good journalism at large, was becoming difficult in large newsrooms and legacy newspapers. So we focus on investigative work. We do long form investigations, particularly looking at the political economy and the union government, because that's where we felt journalism in India was getting a little weak and escaping and running out of Delhi to other safer zones. So we've continued to plow in Delhi and do this work. We've over 5 years produced around 200 different investigative reports in multiple languages. Again, our work began by actually looking at the electoral bond and the first set of revelations on electoral bonds, which I think last year finally reached some logical conclusion with the Supreme Court holding them unconstitutional. And over the period, we've looked at typical nature of crony capitalism in India in the 21st century and how it has changed character, grown or altered, and how the relationship between business, politics, and the economy have altered over time and how it's impacted people. I think the focus we try and keep is not on the victims in particular, which I think is easy in India to find, of malgovernance, but to look at the powerful actors and what they do that lead to malgovernance in India. So that, in short, I guess is it's a good summary of what TRC does.
Lovely. Thank you. I'm glad you brought up electoral bonds because I remember around the time of the Supreme Court hearings and the judgment, the resources that the Reporters Collective put out was quite impressive, and how much detail you were able to go into in unpacking the electoral bond issue was extremely useful for a lot of us. Um, but today we wanted to talk to you about something else that has been a recurring theme in the Reporters Collective's, I guess, quest to unravel the crony capitalism that has come to pervade through much of our country's recent past. Maybe not so recent anyway, but uh, so I've been reading with interest some of the reports that Reporters Collective as a whole have put out on Mr. Adani and the Adani Group, and of course the recent allegations from coming from the United States, especially allegations of bribing Indian government officials for power deals. I think that sort of put the focus back on, and we wanted to understand from you, Nitin, how you saw this sort of last 1 month or so sort of unravel something that has been, like I said, a recurring theme, a recurring allegation against this particular union government. But can you start us off with the overall issue and then take us through to what your investigation or your understanding is, and then we can maybe build on that by asking you something more.
Sure. So I think all your listeners would know of the recent episode that's happened with the US authorities, um, specifying allegations against Mr. Gautam Adani and the Adani group of paying or attempting to pay, or as they said, scheme to pay bribes in India to get power deals through a union government entity. And the allegations, obviously, from the US entity is that that was done without informing the US investors about the nature of business and the kind of enterprise Adani Group undertakes in India, for which it was looking for funds in the US, and therefore they're held liable for certain wrongful, illegal activities in the US jurisdiction for not having acknowledged what they were doing to the US investors. On that particular case, we looked at where the origins of this entire allegation lay, which was in the bidding process of the solar auction itself, and how those were rigged or not rigged, and what happened during that process. But I think this has been an overarching theme that we've seen across at least three or four sectors where the Adani Group is a major player. We've looked at the coal sector, we've looked at the energy sector at large, which includes renewables and coal. We've looked at the food sector, where Adani Group has made large moves, and we've seen their influence in the farm laws, etc. And at all points, what we've uh, eventually found, and we can't as journalists say what their intent is, but we found that the government would very conveniently bend rules, regulations, and regulatory processes in a fashion that would, by default, end up aiding and abetting the businesses of Mr. Adani. Um, it's a classic case of what would be called crony capitalism, as far as I understand. Um, has it been done before? I think it has very often been done before in India. It's not new. But I think the scale, the pervasiveness, and also the brazenness with it it's been done in the last few years is quite stunning, even to somebody like me who's tracked this kind of stuff for last 15, 20 years. To me, that brazenness, one, two, that happening across sectors, replicated at scales that we've not seen before, that enmeshing of the business and politics at that close end is quite unique, at least in my limited understanding of the relationship between business and politics in India. Again, we've seen past episodes, and we've all, I think, witnessed in our lifetimes other cases of such close proximity and questionable proximity between business and politics. But the scale in this case has been really quite stunning. And the rapidness with which the systems have dissolved to allow this to happen, what you think would be the scaffolding of laws, the scaffolding of constitutions, or the scaffolding of institutions to prevent this, I think the rapidness with which they've collapsed is also quite stunning. And to me, that in the longest run, you'll always have a Mr. Adani or somebody else who's a rising star of a particular era as a business proposition in an emerging economy. I think that the worrisome bit is of to look around and say, what are the institutions around this time doing? And to see them crumble at scales, crumble so quick and crumble so badly is the worrisome bit, because I think it's very difficult to recover institutionally from these things. You can move on, economies grow and they grow strengths. I think as we scale up as an economy, we'll see other episodes. But once institutions crumble, I think it's horribly difficult to rebuild them and rebuild faith in them. And to me, that as a watchdog, if you want to call Reporters Collective, to watch that happen in front of our eyes in such a short while is a worrisome bit.
I'm just going to ask one quick question there before I invite Ruchir and Mitali to pitch in as well. Um, so I don't want to sound like I've just read Ayn Rand, but shouldn't the market sort of correct itself or regulate itself? You fairly said there is an Adani, but then there are also other players, and wouldn't they also be putting a lot of pressure to ensure that it doesn't sort of swing one person's way completely? And secondly, the point about regulatory mechanisms, and I think that sort of tied into much of the narrative this year around SEBI, for instance. And but then this is of course a different regulator. This is the Solar Energy Corporation, I believe. So I mean, what is the regulatory systems around these sort of coal and solar related auctions and tenders, and what have you seen that has sort of shocked you or surprised you?
So, if you went back to 2014 when we had this alleged coal scam that brought down the previous government in parts, where allegations were made of hundreds of coal blocks being given almost on completely discretionary basis, and the Supreme Court then annulled all of them, saying they were all illegally done, and a new clearer regime would be set in place, which would be based on auctions, maximum recovery of wealth from selling of these national assets, at least to the national exchequer. And if you look back after 10 years, this is us having rigorously followed it for 10 years now. In both the legacy area of coal industry and the sunrise industry, as it's called, of the solar business, in both the systems, there's been absolutely dark hole of regulatory frameworks. The entire 10 years of this regime has been built on absolute discretion, burnt and baked into the regulatory regimes. So you have hundreds of pages of regulatory processes that says how auction shall be done on coal, how auction shall be done on solar process. And if you actually cut through all of that as a lawyer, which you would do much better than we do, if you reached it by the end, you'll say, hey, at the end of this 100 pages, all it actually says is union government can do whatever it wants. It can auction off the manner in which it wants, to whom it wants, and sometimes it can even not auction off while calling it an auction. And I think that is also in some sense quite unique. You came from an era where Supreme Court held that the previous coal blocks were given away by discretion in absence of regulatory systems in place. In the last 10 years, you've got an entire plethora of laws, regulations, bylaws, office memorandums, hundreds of them that we've come across. And yet you've seen at stage after stage, the state operate with absolute discretion. So let me give you, and I'll pause with one example. Remember, in this Supreme Court order, the court said what was happening at that time was that the state governments were taking coal blocks and handing them through the back door to private companies without disclosure of at what rates it was happening. 2015, this government comes in, announces we will now earn 3 lakh crores worth of revenue over the next few years by having this open auction, transparent, etc. And when we went through all that process and we reviewed all that over repeatedly, what we found was literally coal blocks being handed over as gifts to people again. And the law just justifying it, saying, yes, the state now has the power to hand it over as gifts. So what you had, if it was there was a notion of that being illegal earlier, is now being given the cover of legality. So I keep remember, some my friend today was talking about this, and I keep thinking this question that people raise about legality and illegality in India. The question that at this stage of crony capitalism you need to be asking is: are laws so horrible? Are laws so bad that you cannot go by laws? You need to go by morality of what's happening rather than as journalists, at least for us, to not just talk about laws, but the morality of the way the business operates today. And to me, it's completely corroded. There is no moral framework in which business and politics now relate with each other.
Truthfully, for me, the shock wasn't that rights were offered. And so the surprise for me was that the US, New York State is prosecuting Adani, and nobody in India is prosecuting Adani. And like and it's not just Adani. Like I think we must have so many cases where investigations probably die. I have a question around like this idea of national champions, right? Like this idea that some companies are supposed to do the work of the state because the state cannot actually build scale in our country, 1.4 billion people. This challenge will always be there where we will have to use Reliance and Adani, some of the Bajaj, especially historically, all of the big families that were very close to Congress, will have to continue to be used to build out these different aspects of our country. How do you feel about just the concept? Like I don't want to necessarily focus on Adani, but as a concept, what do you think, Nitin? Does that make sense?
So to me, there are two challenges. One, if we were to just accept saying there is, and many other growing economies have used this notion of national champions, China in particular, which has used this as a metaphor of how its economy boosts in different sectors, real estate to steel to semiconductors. But I think the other thing the Chinese economy has, which we don't at all, even if we want to accept this concept, is that capital is subservient to state. In all the Chinese cases where you look at these national champions, they grow to a certain size, but the people who own the capital do not. After a while, oddly, they disappear, right? Or they just go away. And that, in some sense, tells you the state is in eventual control of capital. These are conduits or agents of the state uh, deploying capital free of the regulatory regime that otherwise the state deploys for much of the other purposes. In India, that's clearly not the case. In this case, capital drives the state. And therefore, we cannot. This is oranges and apples. This is not a similar case where you can't use the same phrase in this case. If you have such unhinged capital that there is no regulatory control, that the wealth capture is so high in the hands of few, then you can see the weakness of the state there. In the Chinese case, you never see the weakness of the Chinese state per se, even as capital wealth accumulation through the national champions happens. Two, something I think which is much more fundamental to step back from national champions and the logic of them being the engines of growth in an emerging economy, particularly in a large emerging economy, is the principles of democracy and equity. In China, you do not have them, neither do they claim to have those publicly announced. We have it enshrined in our constitution. And there is an externalizing of a cost of this kind of growth. The externalizing of the cost is of people on the margins. You do have, therefore, the kind of K-shaped growth you see. You do have that kind of unemployment that you see. It is a consequence of these national champion, a, a weird national champion model that you have in India. This is not even the Chinese model. You do have the consequences of the heartburn and the risks that you see in the marginal communities and the anger that you see burning in certain segments of society that emerges out of this. And that is the externalizing of the costs by the wealth creators. And that the entire democracy has to bear that cost. I think you cannot ignore that fact. You cannot just look at the economy as a standalone factor that separates itself from what happens to the rest of the social fabric of the country when we grow like this. I would rather think that the only reason we need growth is to have a better equitous growth where people who had less opportunities find a little more than they had a decade ago or previous generations. If that's not happening, then what you have is wealth creation and wealth accumulation in the hands of few. That's worrisome. I don't think we've seen an equivalence. I've looked at Brazil, I've looked at Indonesia, I've looked at South Africa. Except for South Africa, which has a colonial reason of apartheid where it happened this way, no other large emerging economy has gone through this process. What we're doing to ourselves is quite incredulously dangerous. It will have long-term economic impacts as well as social impacts that we can't escape very quickly. I say this with great seriousness and also thoughtfulness. I think it's not thrown out as a rhetoric. but there are deeper consequences of this nature of growth continuing for 5 years after 5 years, and you will see the shredding of social fabric out of it. Today was coming out of conversations between friends from tribal communities, which are just looking at land being accumulated by state for private sector in the last 10 years. It's crazy because you're not seeing economic activity, but you're seeing alienation of land from the same communities who are not even getting the regular jobs on Manrega that you were getting a decade ago. And the anger that presents is very different. So I think there's a fair reason for us to pause to even say we need growth. I think there's none of us here doubt the fact that India needs considerable growth over the next 3 decades. But the nature of growth and how you drive it is an essential element of where we will be 20 years from now and whether we will be a healthy democracy or not.
May I argue and stay on this point for 2 more minutes, which is this idea, like if we look at state-owned enterprises in our country, bar like LIC and maybe a few state-owned banks, there are not fabulous examples of growth being shared successfully amongst people in the way you described in China. I mean, if you look at the electricity sector, which I know very well, and that is where the whole scandal has happened. Like every single, most of the electricity distributors in India are bankrupt. And a bunch of leaders, like I'll not be specific, tend to make their money privately through these vehicles, state-owned vehicles. So in many ways, like since 91, obviously that's like the best. We've seen a growth trajectory on a per capita basis, bar agricultural income. So if that is the case, and that's mostly come through the private sector, like why not allow like a few private actors to get bigger? And I don't necessarily believe that, but I just want to argue that point, Nitin, relative to state-owned actors basically building these businesses out.
Well, lots of private actors should grow bigger. Why just few? Here's a chance for many of us to grow bigger. All of us we are at that vantage point in our economy. The stage of our economy is such that you could unleash really a massive growth by unleashing power, by distributing power and wealth resources at the base load instead of doing mudra loans that are complete scams, right? There's great opportunity to having a full market operation, but would you call the operation of three or four discretionary powers who, to me, some of those actors we've discovered actually recirculate political money? That's all they do. They're actually capturing the political money and recirculating it in the economy. Is that market? I don't think so. I don't think any one of us fundamentally thinks a market is where three players grow at the cost of everyone else. This fascinating new entrepreneurship that you see cutting across caste today, which perhaps didn't exist 50 years from now, that is not being unleashed. You are actually restricting the availability of capital to the caste groups which have been historically disadvantaged when you keep growing capital in the same net of few families, few friends. I think a true fascinating level of growth, which would be more equitous, which would be more prosperous for everyone. I mean, again, something that other economists keep pointing. Look at our consumption patterns. We do not consume at the lower levels of income strata. Our consumption is coming from higher strata. It reflects on what's happening to us. I think I forget the gentleman's name, but talks about how we don't produce for the poor. Our production is meant for the rich. Our consumption is driven by the rich, and increasingly so. It's just bad economics. I mean, forget everything else. Forget the logic of whether it will hurt democracy or not. It's just inefficient use of capital that you have if you do not distribute it in the hands of people who are more desirous of growing. People from B towns, people from communities that did not have opportunities early, who would be far more desperate and far more efficient in utilizing that capital. If you do not provide it to them and you sequester it in the hand of you, I think you're creating a tinderbox which is gonna burst in different ways, and it's gonna be worrisome at all levels. And you can see some of those reverberations today.
My turn. I guess I have a slightly wider question, Nitin, and maybe it sort of takes you out of the political economy remit. which is to understand a little bit more about this relationship and where it started. I mean, India has had several business families. That's sort of been, the structure of a large part of how very large industries have run in India. So that's not new. But as you point out, the intertwining in this case is quite stunning. Give us a sense or paint a picture for us on how it started, where it started, and why it got so closely interlinked between what seems to be the ruling majority party and one of the two in the duopoly that seems to exist at this point in India. And I guess I have a second sort of extended question to that, which is, as you were pointing out, with the previous government, with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh at that point in time, it really took over public consciousness, this conversation around corruption, the sort of, enough is enough. I mean, it was anti-incumbency, of course, but there was this level of frustration amidst a large section saying, we're going to clean this corrupt act out. And it feels like that hasn't quite been the tone and tenor this time. Is it a function of the fact that not enough information is provided through our profession, which is journalism, or does it seem like something else? So, two parts, where did this political relationship with this particular business family develop? And why is it that there isn't as much anger, but also sort of questioning about it as one would think there should be?
Can I try and attempt to answer the second one first? I think there's several reasons to why corruption and political corruption hasn't made its mark in this regime. I think it's one, it's over centralized, which is great for business. Uh, in the previous regime, you had decentralized corruption of the nature that businesses dislike because they love single window clearances. You have such centralized systems of corruption today. Electoral bonds is one example of it. That's giving it a legal constitutional cover, but roughly it translates into a centralized corruption format where even within the party, there are only few who get to handle all the resources that are coming in. Unlike you take the case of Congress, where it is so decentralized, sometimes even Congress does not know where its money is lying, or at least in the past when it was lying somewhere. They would have these multi trusts and organizations all over the country, and sometimes critical people only knew where those lands and those assets were. In this case, there's over centralization, which I think business loves. So business is not complaining, at least the ones who are gaining out of it. The small businesses are, but they've never had great voice. To, I mean, I don't think between you and I, we need to reaffirm the nature of what's happened to journalism in the last 10 years. It's nearly dead. Uh, it wasn't any time great, but it's been crushed quite systemically in the last 10 years. Again, something I worry about that we won't recover from this very anytime soon. And three, I think something incredible has been achieved in the last 10 years by the state, if you want to call it, or by this government. It's managed to create enough other parallel conversations to engage our minds, which the previous government, I mean, if you don't want to give them any other credit, I don't, at least give them the credit that they did not use um, subjugation of a class of citizens and second grading a class of citizens as the alternative focus to take away from what they otherwise did in business. I think that has driven us in one direction, communally divided us, and kept us busy. Three, I think this party, BJP in particular, has been great in mobilizing media and social media to create a set of atmospherics which distracts you very systemically. You can say it's the emergence of the new economy, new digital economy at some levels, but I think they've been quite incredible how they've invested in that and how proactively they engage in that as an essential art of staying in power, which the previous government I can clearly see they weren't. I remember, like, I was one of my editors when he chucked me out of a job in the last few years. He said, you couldn't even find a good positive story to tell about the government. I said, it's horribly difficult because everything they find good about themselves, they publicize it the next second. they don't give journalism an opportunity to do that. So it's terribly difficult, as much as I try and find one, given the chance. Previous regime, you could literally sometimes go and the left hand would not know what the good things the right hand had done, and you could pull it off once in a while. So I think that to try and respond to your first question, which has a far wider, I think some historians might be better placed than I am, but I'll give it a shot. I think post liberalization, something responding also to something Ruchir was talking about. I see this in particular in areas where your market economy has grown rapidly, but you did not have concomitant levels of regulatory systems put in place. You had a tribunalization of justice at the same time. You had a reduction in the regulatory process. So maybe you did not need, and we certainly did not need the license Raj of the pre 80s and the 80s. But you did need new regulators to look at the markets and operate them as competitive spaces. And that has completely disappeared. So if you look at today, if you looked at Europe, US, and India at completely three different stages, and you said, how many regulators do you have for the telecom sector, say the pharma sector, the food sector in India compared to what per capita or per quantum, you can take any measure whatsoever in Europe and US, you'd find India is at a horrible low. Our regulatory processes that we had to build for an emerging economy, which was a private economy, has not been built over last 10 years. We've actually decapitated what we had, and for fair reasons, some of it had to go. The licensing Raj has to go, which is fair. But you've not built anything for the new regime. And that has allowed great fusion between capital and politics at scales. To something I've touched upon, and people, my own colleagues and friends, including some in Reporters Collective, sometimes disagree with me. I think there's a great hypocrisy in our society that emerges on the nature of funding that is required to run politics in India. And that hypocrisy is ours, not of the political actors. And that hypocrisy is ensured that politics that needs funding of a certain kind finds it from other routes. Because there's a delegitimacy of a politician, budding politician, actually making money out of his politics. So, I mean, say Manu has a practice where he does. If he did not come from a position where he could practice as a lawyer, and he still wanted to join politics, I and you and Ruchir would insist that he should be a frugal politician who should see not seem to be earning money out of politics. But then he would need money to run politics, and therefore he'd end up doing a second life, which we would call as illegal or immoral, right? So I think this overall space of how politics in India runs based on some ideas from a Gandhian era at some point, which were funded by billionaires of that era, I think has landed us in a great soup. I mean, I was just looking at data from North Karnataka, North Bangalore constituency. It's got 70 lakh voters. The budget spend limit by election commission is 90 lakhs, which means honestly a candidate can only send 3 SMSs to each person and then sit back home. Right? That's legally what he or she can do. Yet for 50 years, everyone seems to have done that and survived. So there is that grand hypocrisy that's allowed this gray spacing of politics and business working together. I don't know whether the way out is to legitimize and bring in adopt a system which acknowledges the resources that are required for Indian politics, or to go the whole hog the other way. But clearly, this present phase of hypocrisy has really landed us in a bad soup, and I don't think it's going away. I mean, I'm the first one who cracked the electoral bond stuff. We brought it out, and we're glad it's done with, because it legitimized corruption and crony capitalism at scales we had not seen. But the fact is, if you look at the quantum of money that went through it, it was just 25,000 crores. It's not a huge sum. Much of what gets spent in an average state assembly election is much more than that. So clearly, there's much bigger at stake. You cannot imagine that you'll have the nature of economy you have today, but have the regulation that existed in the 80s and 90s, and you will let them work. I think that acknowledgement that we are willingly, unwillingly a market economy today, and we might as well try and turn it into a better market economy than be this market economy which is captured by a few players. Um, is the way I would think. I know several of my friends would disagree and say, "Hey, we need to have a more, left of center understanding of where economics has taken us." But this is where I stand, and in that, I think post 2000s, you have a particular emergence of new regulatory places. So, say telecom, environment. These are places where you see regulatory licenses still exist in different names. They're called green clearances, this, that. But you've seen an emergence of new licensing systems. You don't have anything else except discretionary licensing system where 10 bureaucrats and a minister sit together and decide what's going to be done. You've not imagined a market incentive disincentive system. So say I've followed environment very closely, Mitali, something you passionately look at. We've got 6 environment laws in the center, right? All of them have punitive measures which never got applied. So I was looking at data of how many people have ever been put behind bars for environmental damage in India. Four. Since the Environment Protection Act came into place. Four people, right? At the other hand, you have no carrots for actually doing well. So you have a regulatory regime that's completely failed business. You've led to immense corruption. You've not saved environment, and you've got even no incentive to citizenry to do better than before. And it comes from the 1980 logic. It comes from the pre-market logic, and everyone's worried at this stage that laws should not be tinkered with because everyone's worried that this state, when it, if you open up a law today, it will even turn worse than what it is. So everyone's a little worried about reopening. But I think there's a, in some sense, if not today, tomorrow, there's an opportunity to think about these regulatory regimes, the laws that we have of certain sectors in particular, and are they conducive in acknowledging our realities? Forget working for them, but do our laws even acknowledge our realities today, or do they come from a imagination in the 60s and the 50s?
Can I ask a quick sort of follow-up question to that, and then I'll, pass on to Manu or Ruchir, which is, one is the regulation, Nitin, and one is the laws and what exists, and the other is the regulator and the law enforcer. And I mean, I'm watching with some shock and awe at how India's securities regulator SEBI has basically navigated this whole space, where, as you say, there are some serious allegations made by a security regulator in another country, and here you have a situation where findings have not been submitted, where the head of the institution seems compromised but will not step away from investigations. Neither will she, open herself up to any kind of questioning. uh, in all the years that you've tracked it, and you must have had lots of intersections with, okay, what's the regulator doing about a listed company? Have you ever come across a situation where it's been this much of a can't see, can't hear, won't speak state of play?
I sound contrarian, but I have. This is not any worse than what's happened in the last 15, 20 years, I think. And again, our imagination of what a regulator ought to be and how does that regulator respond to citizenry rather than to state. um, I think we missed the bus on that. The regulator's transparency to citizens was the only check we ever had. It was not having the regulator in the first place. Because if the regulator appointed by the state is only answerable to the state, then you will be where we are today. The logic of a regulator is he or she or they capture information in an intelligent fashion and present it to citizens for accountability, and that ensures that the state also answers to that regulator, or at least brings that little difference. In Indian conditions, you see across the board, from telecom, you look at the 90s, you go to the 2000, you come today, each regulator is built on opaqueness, that the regulator's only responsibility is either to the litigant that comes before it, or the actors that come before it, or the state. And therefore, across sector after sector, when you look, why, if you look at the environment sector, you look at the mining sector, you look at telecom, you look at highways, wherever you go across the board, you'll find the law does not bake in any transparency for the regulator's response to the citizens. So you look at the GST Council, it's a classic case. The GST law itself talks about how there would be regular information put out about how much data has been collected. You today are in a regime where I know personally GST intelligence officers have had to file RTIs in their own government to get data that they want to inspect, because the law forgot to say that it should be transparent at least to the officers, if not to citizens. You look at the bankruptcy code. It has a separate section that talks about transparency of the bankruptcy system to the citizenry. That's the only part which has never been operationalized in the law. Everything else has been operationalized to some or the other extent. So I think it's fairly messy. It's always been there. Just that because the scale of the economy keeps growing, the scale at which you see the nonsense flow out of these consequences is bigger and bigger. You've had scams before. It's not the first time that SEBI's been caught napping at the door or at the driving seat. You've seen systemic absence of information over the last 2 decades on various episodes of inside trading that we've been recorded. It's just that the scale where the level of flow of money from Mauritius and other places, it's gonna keep growing, and fairly they should. But the only way the regulator, I believe, will be answerable and better is when the regulator clearly has a section that says this is a level of disclosure you must present in a intelligent, cogent fashion to citizens, not to the state itself. So if SEBI is going to be appointed by the state, good and bad people will come, or horrible people will come in those positions. But if those appointments are clear to us, why they've been appointed, or what functions do they provide every day? I mean, imagine you're in a point where RBI has fought off for 9 years the Right to Information Act to even list down the number of accounts which are mentioned as NPA, right? It's fought for 9 years in the court of law, and nobody's bothered one way or the other about it. So I think our entire concept of what a market regulator is and how does that regulator get held accountable to citizens. The state cannot be the middleman between the regulator and the citizens. There has to be a direct accountability there. And if you see across the world, you'll find regulators constantly disclosing more, their disclosure levels to citizens going up. If you look at US FDA there, it has its own challenges. It's also compromised in many ways. But how do you find it out? You find it out because there's a constant detailing of what all information it must make public. In India, it's just been reversed. We've actually reduced the amount of information the regulator has to provide to citizenry. And I think that is a long term challenge for the nature of institutions we build. That they're not built as these haloed grounds which are, above reproach and above questioning because there's some great people who sit there. But these institutions are built in a fashion that they respond to citizens very quickly. That I think partly comes from our strange caste system driven idea that the institutions must be these very high haloed grounds where nobody can touch them and nobody can bother them and they will always provide great justice. I think that's conceptually there's a problem with the way Indian society imagines regulators.
One thing I will say there, I think the reporters should take part of the blame because I think um, historically our reporting on questioning institutions has been really poor. And even now, like previously, we've argued in multiple episodes, like we don't question our Supreme Court or judicial appointments at all, even though they're political. We've discussed. I think. I mean, like you, Nitin. I think most regulators in most markets are extensions of governments, and they are usually deploying the agenda of the government. One thing I really liked in what you said was the the economic situation of politicians. I think you are so right. I used to argue with my wife. She's from Singapore, and they pay $4 million to the prime minister. And I would often like argue how much is enough, and that comes from my Indian roots, like as in politics is about service and not about making money. So I would often like be at the same end of the argument that you just outlined, which is that politicians should do it for good and not for money. But you're right. I mean, they have to live.
I
So
mean,
that point, yeah.
I have several politicians as relatives in my families across spectrum, across political parties. Like I've looked at, so I'm adopted. My father is an MLA, two-time MLA who's now retired, and he was a clerk in the education department when he began, right? And he came from a community where there are only 6,000 voters. The logic is completely different, driven by clans, so one can survive. But how would you otherwise expect a Dalit candidate from a small community cornered out in UP or Bihar to stand up and say, I have as much political aspirations, as much acumen as the next person? but damn, I need to at least have petrol and food enough to run around my constituency for the next 90 days. Um, and you will end up in this position. That Dalit candidate will end up going to some person to borrow money, and he or she will then owe the part of their soul to that character for the rest of their lives, or at least the next foreseeable 10 years. And because that will be an investment in the person, he will have to give a rate of, return on that investment to the person who's it put in. I mean, I know several people, I'm sure Manu knows of this much deeper because he's closer to a party than I am. I still look at it from a periphery. uh, but it's essential to acknowledge that frugality has to be afforded, right? Uh, or a decent life has to be afforded. Now, you can live with the pretense of frugality, but most often the people who can afford that frugality are people who've got the will to afford it. The rest have to work day in, day out.
I also think it's true for most of our bureaucracy. Like, I imagine most of our corruption would reduce if we paid our bureaucrats more. Even like the police man on the, like, who takes your 100 rupees for letting you go, like, would not take it if they were paid better, I think. And you would have more money in the system, so the economy would grow. A lot of it would come back in taxes, so you'd be able to afford repayments or paying our bureaucrats more. So I also think that's true across the chain, not just for politicians. Like, we should pay uh, government employees better.
Yeah, I don't know what I would love to hear Mitali and Manu on this because you come from different worlds and perspectives on this. I think something that we
Wha-
must talk about more often than we do, at least.
Absolutely. No, while I agree with a lot of what Ruchir has said, um, the fact that Ruchir, you brought up Singapore, I think is an interesting tangent, because if you want to go along if you want to look into Singapore as a model, though they've done fantastically on so many fronts, the Singapore first family is still very much in control, and a lot of the resources. I don't know if it's closer to the India model of where Nitin described it as state subservient to capital, or the China model, but there is such an overlap of capital and right, at the head of the state family there. But uh, I know it's been a pretty heavy sort of discussion, because we started with, of course, Reporters Collective, Adani, and then we went to China through the national champions question, and then Nitin brought us to South Africa. And while doing so, he gave us a lot of food for thought around economics, and then rightfully, I think we've ended close to the regulatory issues, right? But I hope this narrative doesn't lead people who are watching this to believe that we are placing this undue importance on the regulatory mechanism or lack thereof, right? I think it is true. India's regulatory mechanisms are weak. They are subservient to the people who appoint them. The regulators often are very inefficient, and there is no accountability, as Nitin put it, to the citizens at large. But that still should not, that still should not let the judiciary go off easily, right? Because they should have been the primary sort of watchdogs, right? Not it need not should not have come for the Reporters Collective to be the primary watchdog, for example, right? The judiciary, the fact is still today that as soon as a party comes into power, there is a capture of more than the media, more than the regulatory mechanisms, even partly, or great extent, the judiciary sort of starts playing ball, or starting to uh, become in sync with the government of the day. And I think that's the reason why a lot of this sort of blame has also been placed rightfully on the regulators. But then what is the role of the business persons, right? I mean, they are led to believe that, as Nitin's sort of last example pointed out, if they make an investment in a political candidate, or a political party, then they want to get something back, right? It is not a principled sort of donation towards a cause that they believe in. It is more very practically, pragmatically, I am giving you so much money to run this campaign, so therefore these contracts, these tenders, these auctions should all be sort of linked to me. So I think that sort of brought us back to where we started in a way, right? Why we are discussing this by and large is because of this sort of influence that has been exerted by one or two or a few major corporate groups. And I think it will not solve by just sort of changing the regulatory system. I think it will need to be addressed through conversations like this. And I'll go back to one point that Nitin and Ruchir both sort of made on the on how much money should be paid to politicians, bureaucrats. And again, Singapore is a great example, right? Just because you pay them a market salary, does that immediately mean that they do get? I mean, it is the kind of it gives you the kind of honest, sincere sort of public service that you aspire to. I don't know. I don't think it's a sure shot certainty. I think we are sitting here thinking that's a better model. Why don't we try that? And I'm all for that. But I want to just quickly say one thing before I wrap and push this towards Mitali, which is Nitin, you said a lot of this is based on the caste based or caste system thinking, right? That these regulators or these sort of higher authorities ought not to be questioned. But if you go back and read Plato's Republic, so he looks at he classifies these roles as guardians, right? He calls them the guardians or the guards, and the guardians are supposed to be philosopher kings. So again, this sort of thought process that there should be a person or people on top who are much higher in class, in intellectual thinking, has always been there, and I think once people go to the top, they do start building these very, very strong shields and protections around them and their friends. And that is sort of how it has all been. But I think this has been a great conversation for me to listen and understand all everyone's perspectives. On that note, I'm going to slowly push this to Mitali for her last sort of words, and then we can come back to Nitin for his wrap up.
No, thanks, Manu. No last words. It feels like it's a bit of a continuum conversation rather than this is the start and this is the finish. And I know there'll be sort of much more that happens not just on this company, but around the broader topic of what we're discussing, which is really what is the India that we want to see look like? And who does it include and who does it exclude? I think that's kind of something we're all grappling with over the last few years. I want to switch up the tone maybe and introduce Nitin to Have You Heard, which I think Ruchir primed you about. So, Nitin, we do this every week. It's something that you read or saw or came across that you'd really love to share with people who are listening in or watching this conversation. Are you all set? Do you want to go first, or do you want one of us to sort of pick it up and then pass the baton
I
to you?
Yeah, I'll come at it
Okay,
later.
good. Okay, so then let me start with Ruchi.
I often go to technology, it's my go-to subject, but there's a little bit of a twist, which is that Google announced its quantum computer or a new chip called Willow. And quantum computer has been spoken about for quite a while. It can solve problems, very, very complex problems, much faster than the fastest supercomputer. So Willow has 105 qubits, which is equivalent of like computer bits. And they solved a problem in 5 minutes, which the world's fastest supercomputer may have taken 10 septillion years. I don't think I've used the word septillion before in my life. I mean, it is so huge. And so, what is quantum computing? It's an incredibly complex answer. But one of the tangents which I want to talk about is quantum computing as a concept came out of an accident of a guy called David Deutsch doing research into this multi-world theory. So this idea that there are multiple universes that exist, we all exist in different realms, and we intersect each other in these multiple universes. And if the different states in multiple universes are the same, then they merge into one universe, and then you have multiple universes that exist in parallel. So if quantum computing does play out as a real concept, that means multiverses or multiple worlds is real. which is a crazy thing to wrap your mind around. There's a little bit of sci-fi around this. I think there's a show I've watched called Fringe, but I just love this idea of multiple universes. There's multiple of all of us doing recording a podcast right now and saying maybe slightly different opinions. Anyway, that's my have you heard.
Very
And
cool.
if
And when I
Christopher
first
Nolan's watching this podcast, then I think, Richie, you've just given him his next movie script from your Have You Heard?
And
Can I?
when I first saw the announcement, Manu, the first thing I thought of was cricket, like sort of being a hard boiled Indian egg. It was like, oh, Willow. Hmm. What's your have you heard?
I have one that is sort of fresh of the news today. 18-year-old Chennai boy has become the world chess champion. He's literally a boy. He's 18. I guess he's turned 18 this year. And he's of course from Chennai, so he must be good. But really, he was the underdog, as they say, in this entire year, because he was challenging the world champion Ding. And from what little chess I can follow, it was going neck to neck until pretty much the last move, or the move that sort of ended it. So apparently that was the only mistake that world champion Ding made, and it proved to be extremely costly. And that apparently, when they were sort of calculating statistically his winning percentage, it went from less than 0.3% to he won, ultimately becoming the world champion. But it made me think, right? One, can you become a world champion when you're 18? Like, of course, but you have to start very young. And chess is great because, as Indians, we have our physical limitations. So perhaps you should do that. Secondly, just I think also, economically, chess is so simple. You just have a board, and you need somebody who's very smart to teach you. But of course, if you can afford that, you can work on that. But the third thing, and the most important according to me, is how one small mistake can cost you a world championship, right? And I think, as they say in cricket, you play in sort of inches and centimeters. So it was really mind blowing if people were following this, and also to see a 18-year-old become world champion. So that's my have you heard.
Mine is sort of similar, and I knew that there was going to be someone else who picked that, which is Gukesh Manu. And there are these videos floating around of when he was, I don't know, maybe 6.5, and someone asked him, "So, what are your interests? You like chess, and what do you want to do?" And this little tiny tot is saying, "I want to be the world champion." And the interviewer sort of nodding benignly, saying, "Yes, yes, of course." And it's kind of like, yes, he did. But I'm thinking of it a different way, and I'm thinking of Vishwanathan Anand, Vishy Anand, and just this. I mean, this is what a legacy looks like, and if any of us in our lifetimes can do one fraction of what he's done for a space that he excelled in, what a legacy that would be. To not stop there, but to build this, and he's literally built this ecosystem of these ninja warriors who play chess so incredibly well, and he's just put India on top there. Hats off to having that sort of commitment. So you don't call it a day when you've had your best days. You sort of leave something that really looks like a legacy in that field. And I was thinking about him as well. It's now your turn, Nitin.
Hmm. Something really obscure though. I've been in the last year or so been hooked into our my adopted community is called Galo in Arunachal, and normally Arunachali music historically had a lot of Assamese influence, and Assamese had Bengali influence. So you'd roughly end up listening to the same kind of tunes and frequencies. And in the last 6 months, thanks to my younger brother and sister, I've been finding this amazing new Galo rock uh, emerging, which is fascinating. The kind of music they're producing is stunning. You will not find these sounds even in Southeast Asia that they're finding. And these are really, like, our community is really small. It's like 1.5 lakh people in some areas itself. So I would recommend somebody who wants to listen. There's a young chap called Chorun Mugli you should hear. There's somebody called Nico Mriba, and you listen to their music and it's charming, and they're also going back and finding our old folk songs and turning them into popular rock stuff. And these guys by now are legends. Like, women fall all over these boys because they have the charm of the old world and they have the charm of the new world. And my younger sister was saying, if if I would get chance to kiss them all, if this is the and you hear them and you know them. They've got like something very earthy about them, and the young characters, and yet they hooked into the best music systems across the world, and they're figuring out what's to be done. And I would say it's again, it's built on some elders in our community who got these guys out and said, here's a small studio, sit there and record. So, as you were saying, the common thread being that you need these elders who done their bit, but they've also created spaces for the next generation to build, sit on their shoulders and become bigger. That to me, I was thinking when you were speaking. That's why I remembered these kids, because they were built on shoulders of our elders who did their own stuff, didn't weren't so famous, but the new chaps have just skyrocketed out of the Galo world into other spaces.
I've, writ- I've written their names down. I need to look up the music. Um, Nitin, thank you again for being here. And that was a fascinating conversation. I mean, I think we covered so much of like the work we need to do as a country. So we're grateful for your time and the work you do. I really appreciate it. Thanks, Manu and Mitali, for all of you. We hope you enjoyed this. If you have any feedback, please email us at indiadialoguepodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us all on Twitter or X. Nitin Sethi is at NIT_SET. That's basically the first letters of his name, both first name and last name. Manu is at Manuraj1983. Mitali is at Mitali Live. I am at Ruchir_P. The podcast is at TID_podcast, and the YouTube channel is at India Dialogue Podcast. Nitin, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I thought the first thing that you thought we would talk, and we completely missed. Partly my mistake was to look at the Adani's recent happenings itself, or what they've done. And I would suggest this is also a pitch call. Um, we've talked about the US regulators catching them, or at least allegedly catching them, paying bribes to the state. What Reporters Collective found was that the system was rigged at the union government level itself, at scale. Uh, and I think while we were talking at scales, that we forgot these specificities of this case. I think it's useful to go back to that story to say, um, how did it start? Where did it start? Could it have happened without the union government? And we found a trail of documentary evidence to show that from the scratch, the union government was rigging the auctions in a fashion that eventually only Adani Group could get much of this. So one could read it at Reporters Collective. I think, as Ruchir, you were saying, journalists are much to blame for the fact that a lot of this does not come out, too, because we ourselves are quite uneducated about what's happening in the country. But any granular work that your readers find on this kind of stuff, it's really worth looking at that, because it's in the small grains that you'll find the food for thought.
And if you find value at the Reporters Collective, please go and donate. I see the accepting donations. Thank you, Nitin, again for sharing that information, and all of you for joining. We look forward to seeing you again next week.